the most powerful woman in Europe, walked into a meeting as the president of a union of 450 million people. She walked out as a figurehead of a crumbling institution that no longer controls its most important member. What happened inside that room was not a disagreement. It was not a negotiation. It was a controlled demolition. And Friedrich Merz held the detonator. Brussels didn't see it coming. The insiders who were there say they have never witnessed anything like it in the entire history of the European Union. And the leaked message that emerged from Berlin in the hours that followed didn't just shock the continent. It rewrote the rules of European power in a single afternoon. This is not a political story. This is the moment Europe broke. The meeting was never supposed to go this way. Behind the closed doors of the Chancellery in Berlin, the official agenda was a routine coordination session. A diplomatic formality dressed in handshakes and carefully worded communiques designed to project unity to a watching world. What the European Commission expected was the familiar rhythm of German compliance. What Friedrich Merz delivered was something the institution had never encountered in 7 decades of existence. He didn't argue, he didn't negotiate. He presented Brussels with a document that one senior German official, speaking on the condition of strict anonymity, described as the most confrontational piece of paper ever handed to a sitting European Commission president on German soil. Von der Leyen reportedly stared at it for 11 seconds before saying a single word. Those 11 seconds, insiders say, were the moment the old European order died. The document was not a proposal. It was not a counteroffer. It was a list of conditions, a stark, numbered, non-negotiable set of demands that effectively told the European Commission that Germany's era of unconditional cooperation was finished. At the top of the list was a demand for the immediate suspension of core provisions of the Green Deal as they applied to German industrial production. Below that, a demand for a complete regulatory rollback on digital governance frameworks that Berlin had long argued were strangling German tech competitiveness. Further down, a demand that the European Court of Justice's jurisdiction over German economic policy be formally reviewed and curtailed. And at the very bottom, a line that one senior EU official later described as reading like a ransom note, a direct statement that Germany's continued financial contributions to the EU budget were now explicitly conditional on the Commission's willingness to meet these demands within a defined timeline. There was no ambiguity. There was no diplomatic softening. There was only the cold arithmetic of a nation that had finally decided to stop absorbing the cost of a project that was cannibalizing its own industrial base. What made the moment even more devastating for Brussels was not the content of the demands. It was the manner in which they were delivered. Friedrich Merz did not arrive in the room as a supplicant seeking relief. He arrived as a sovereign issuing terms. He did not open with the ritual expressions of commitment to European solidarity that German chancellors have performed like a religious sacrament for half a century. He opened with data. Specifically, he opened with a 40-page economic briefing that documented in granular, irrefutable detail the systematic destruction of German industrial capacity that had occurred over the preceding 5 years under the regulatory architecture that the European Commission had constructed and enforced. Factory closures mapped by region, output decline charted by sector, foreign direct investment figures showing German capital fleeing to markets in Southeast Asia and North America at a rate that had no historical precedent in the post-war era. He placed this document in front of von der Leyen not as evidence in search of sympathy, but as an indictment demanding a verdict. The Commission had done this. Berlin was now presenting the bill. The atmosphere inside that room, according to 3 separate individuals with direct knowledge of the meeting, was unlike anything that European diplomacy had produced in living memory. Senior Commission officials who had attended hundreds of high-level EU summits described a quality of silence in that room that felt physically oppressive. Von der Leyen, a politician of considerable experience and composure, was visibly shaken, not by the anger in Merz's delivery, because there was no anger, but by something far more unsettling, the complete and utter absence of it. He spoke with the calm of a man who had already decided the outcome and was simply informing the other party of the terms. There were no raised voices. There were no dramatic gestures. There was only the methodical, almost clinical presentation of a new European reality from a German chancellor who had concluded that performance of unity was now a luxury his country could no longer afford. One official present in an adjacent room described hearing nothing through the walls for nearly 40 minutes. Not discussion, not debate, just silence broken occasionally by the sound of pages turning. What emerged from that silence would rupture the foundational assumptions upon which the European project had operated since the Treaty of Rome. For the Commission, the nightmare was not simply that Germany had made demands. Nations make demands. That is the ordinary friction of political union. The nightmare was the structural logic underneath those demands, a logic that, once spoken aloud, could not be unspoken. Merz had articulated something that a generation of German leaders had felt but never dared to formalise, that Germany's post-war commitment to European integration had functioned, in practice, as a form of geopolitical penance, and that penance had an expiration date. By arriving in Berlin with a document instead of a dialogue, he had transformed what the Commission had always treated as a permanent moral obligation into a transactional arrangement, subject to performance review. He had taken the sacred and made it contractual, and in doing so he had handed every other net contributor nation in the European Union a template, a proof of concept that the unspoken rules of European power were not laws of nature, they were habits. And habits, unlike constitutions, can be broken in a single afternoon. The Commission's response in the immediate aftermath of the meeting was revealing in its incoherence. Official spokespersons issued statements of breathtaking vagueness, speaking of the importance of continued dialogue and the enduring strength of the European partnership in language so drained of specific meaning that it functioned as a confession of institutional paralysis. Behind the scenes, however, the picture was dramatically different. Senior Commission officials were making frantic calls to European capitals, attempting to gauge whether what had just occurred in Berlin was an opening position in a negotiation or a declaration of a fundamentally new relationship. The answers they received did little to reassure them. Several member state governments, when quietly approached for their assessment of the German demands, declined to condemn them. Some, according to sources familiar with the calls, declined with what one Commission insider described as a barely concealed tone of satisfaction. The question that was beginning to crystallise in the corridors of the Berlaymont building was one that nobody in Brussels had ever seriously prepared for. What do you do when the country that built the house decides it no longer wants to live by the house rules? And the answer, terrifyingly, was beginning to look like absolutely nothing. But the document in that room was only half the story. Because in the hours after von der Leyen's motorcade disappeared from the Chancellery grounds, something leaked from Berlin. Something that the Commission had not anticipated, had not wargamed, and had no established protocol to contain. And when its contents reached the desks of senior EU officials late that evening, several of them, according to people present, stopped speaking entirely. Not from shock, from the sudden, suffocating realisation that the meeting they had just survived was not the crisis. It was only the warning shot. It arrived without a header, no official letterhead, no diplomatic classification stamp, no protocol markings of any kind. Just raw text, forwarded through a chain of encrypted channels that security analysts at the Berlaymont building are still attempting to trace with increasing desperation. The leaked message from Berlin that landed in the inboxes of 3 senior European Commission officials late that evening was not a policy document. It was not a press briefing or a strategic memo. It was a private communication between Friedrich Merz and a small circle of his most trusted advisors. A communication that was never meant to leave German soil and whose contents, once read, explained everything about what had happened in that closed room, with a clarity that the official meeting itself had deliberately obscured. Because the document in that room, the 40-page indictment, the numbered demands, the conditional budget threat, all of it had been a performance, a precisely choreographed opening act. The leaked message revealed what the second act looked like. And the second act had nothing to do with negotiation. The message, according to 4 individuals who have seen its contents and spoke under conditions of absolute anonymity, contained a strategic timeline, not a wish list, not a set of aspirations, a sequenced operational blueprint broken into phases with specific institutional targets, specific member state alignments already secured, and specific trigger conditions that would activate each successive phase of what the document referred to internally as the restructuring. The word that does not appear anywhere in that message, not once, is reform. Reform implies working within an existing system to improve it. What the Berlin message described was something categorically different. It described the deliberate, methodical dismantling of the European Commission's executive authority, not through legal challenge, not through treaty renegotiation, but through the far more elegant and far more dangerous mechanism of making the Commission financially irrelevant, while simultaneously building a parallel power structure that could operate without it. Merz was not trying to fix the European Union. He was engineering its replacement from the inside, using Germany's institutional weight as the wrecking ball and the sovereign bloc he had already assembled as the scaffolding for whatever came next. Phase 1, according to the document, was already complete. It was the Berlin meeting itself, the public signalling of German non-compliance designed to shatter the Commission's aura of untouchable authority and demonstrate to every disaffected capital in Europe that the Emperor had no clothes. Phase 2, which the timeline indicated was already in motion at the moment the message was written, involved the surgical phone calls that Merz had initiated within hours of von der Leyen's departure. But the leaked message revealed a dimension of those calls that had not previously been understood. They were not exploratory, they were confirmatory. The conversations with Rome, Warsaw, and Budapest were not Merz testing the waters to see who might be sympathetic to a new European direction. They were Merz informing already committed partners that the operation had entered its active phase and that the agreed protocols were now in effect. Giorgia Meloni, Viktor Orban, and the Polish government had not been recruited in the hours after the Berlin meeting. They had been part of the planning architecture for months. The sovereign bloc was not an improvised response to a moment of German frustration. It was a premeditated coalition that had been quietly constructed, while Brussels was busy congratulating itself on the Green Deal and patting itself on the back for its digital regulatory framework. The Commission had been outmanoeuvred before the game had officially begun. Phase 3 was where Brussels truly lost its composure. Because Phase 3, as described in the leaked message, targeted something the European Commission had always considered structurally untouchable: its control over the legislative agenda of the European Parliament. The Merz blueprint called for the sovereign bloc to deploy its combined voting weight not merely to block individual directives, as Germany had signalled it would do in the Berlin meeting, but to systematically obstruct the Commission's ability to advance any legislative programme whatsoever until specific structural concessions were made. This was not a veto. A veto is a defensive instrument. What the document described was an offensive legislative siege, the sustained, coordinated use of blocking minorities across multiple council formations simultaneously to create a condition of total institutional gridlock that would make the Commission's continued operation functionally impossible without German consent. It was a constitutional hostage-taking, dressed in the procedural language of democratic process. And because every mechanism it employed was technically legal under existing EU treaty frameworks, Brussels had no instrument to stop it, challenge it, or even publicly condemn it without appearing to argue against its own foundational rules. The reaction inside the Belay Mont, when the message's contents became known, was not the controlled crisis management that European institutions like to project to the outside world. It was, by every account of those present, closer to controlled panic dissolving rapidly into uncontrolled panic. Senior officials who had spent careers navigating the most complex geopolitical crises of the modern era found themselves staring at a threat for which no playbook existed, because the threat had been specifically engineered to exploit every gap in the Commission's defensive architecture simultaneously. The legal team was called into emergency session and emerged 3 hours later with an assessment that one participant described as the most devastating document they had ever produced, a conclusion that the sovereign bloc strategy, as outlined in the leaked Berlin message, was almost entirely immune to legal challenge under current treaty law. The communications team was tasked with developing a public response and reported back that any statement strong enough to accurately convey the severity of the situation would itself accelerate the crisis by confirming to markets and member states that Brussels had genuinely lost control. The Budget Office ran the numbers on what a conditional German contribution would mean for the Commission's operational capacity within 6 months and quietly declined to share the full results with the wider staff. The number, sources indicate, was that catastrophic. What made the leaked message uniquely devastating was not just its content, but its timing and its existence. The fact that it leaked at all told its own story, a story that several senior Commission officials immediately recognised and found almost as alarming as the message's contents. Either the document had been deliberately allowed to escape Berlin as a secondary pressure instrument, a way of ensuring that Brussels understood the full scope of what it was facing, without Merz having to make an explicit public threat, or someone inside Germany's own inner circle had decided to expose the blueprint, which raised an entirely different set of questions about the internal coherence of the German government's most sensitive strategic operation. Both possibilities were terrifying in their own distinct way. If the leak was intentional, it meant Merz was operating with a level of strategic sophistication and psychological aggression that made the Berlin meeting look like a diplomatic courtesy call. If it was accidental, it meant that the most consequential geopolitical operation in post-war European history had a security vulnerability somewhere near its core, and that whatever came next would unfold in the full, unforgiving glare of public exposure rather than the controlled darkness of back-channel diplomacy. By midnight in Brussels, the phones in the Commission's senior leadership offices had not stopped ringing for 6 consecutive hours. Calls were coming in from member state governments demanding explanations, from European Parliament faction leaders demanding emergency sessions, from financial institutions in Frankfurt and Paris demanding clarity on the budget implications of German conditionality, and from Washington, where the State Department had been monitoring the situation with the kind of focused attention that only manifests when American strategic interests feel the tremor of a geopolitical shift. The Commission had no answers to give any of them, not because the answers didn't exist, but because every answer available led to the same conclusion. A conclusion that the institution was not yet prepared to speak aloud in official language. The European Union's centre of gravity had moved. It had moved overnight, without a treaty revision, without a referendum, without a single vote being cast anywhere on the continent. It had moved because one man in Berlin had decided that the architecture of post-war European power was a historical arrangement rather than a permanent condition, and had spent months building the machinery to prove it. But what nobody in Brussels had yet grasped, what the leaked message hinted at but did not fully reveal, was that phases 1, 2 and 3 were not the endgame. They were the preparation. Because Friedrich Merz, according to sources with knowledge of conversations that occurred inside the Chancellery in the 48 hours following the Berlin meeting, had already begun. Drafting the framework for something that would make everything that had come before look like a preliminary skirmish. A proposal so structurally radical, so deliberately designed to force a binary choice upon every government in Europe, that several of the advisers who reviewed it in its earliest form reportedly asked whether it was a negotiating position or a declaration of war. Merz's answer, according to one person present in that room, was characteristically precise. He said it was neither. He said it was an architecture. And then he went back to work. The European Union that generations built on the promise of unity, shared prosperity, and the solemn vow of never again, is now staring into a void it created by believing Germany's loyalty was unconditional. Friedrich Merz didn't destroy that belief. He simply stopped maintaining the illusion. The Commission can call emergency sessions. It can issue statements. It can appeal to history and to solidarity and to the sacred memory of what European integration was supposed to mean. But it cannot force a creditor to keep funding a project that is bleeding it dry. The engine has made its decision. The train is slowing. And the passengers are only now beginning to realise that nobody is driving. If you want to stay ahead of the power shifts quietly redrawing the map of our world, subscribe now and hit the bell. Drop your answer in the comments. Is this the salvation of Europe or its eulogy?